The Story of Civilization, Volume 4, The Age of Faith, Part 3, by Will Durant, continued, Cassette 2, Side 1. He had, on the existing evidence, the best mind of his time. In his early 30s, he had written 4 works of theology. They were learned and eloquent, but they are lost in the glare of his political fame. His pronouncements as Pope were characterized by a clarity and logic of thought, a fitness and pungency of phrase that could have made him a brilliant Aquinas or an orthodox Abelard. Despite his small stature, he derived a commanding presence from his keen eyes and stern dark face. He was not without humor. He sang well and composed poetry. He had a tender side and could be kindly, patient, and personally tolerant. But in doctrine and morals he allowed no deviation from the dogmas or ethics of the Church. The world of Christian faith and hope was the empire that he had been named to protect, and like any king he would guard his realm with the sword when the word did not suffice. Born to riches, he lived in philosophic simplicity. In an age of universal venality he remained incorruptible. At once after his consecration he forbade the officials of his curia to charge for their services. He liked to see the wealth of the world enrich Peter's see, but he administered the papal funds with a reasonably honest hand. He was a consummate diplomat, and moderately shared in the reluctant unmorality of that distinguished trade. As if 11 centuries had fallen away, he was a Roman emperor, stoic rather than Christian, and never doubting his right to rule the world. With so many strong popes in the fresh memory of Rome, it was natural that Innocent should base his policies upon a belief in the sanctity and high mission of his office. He carefully maintained the pomp and majesty of papal ceremony, and never stooped in public from imperial dignity. Sincerely believing himself the heir to the powers then generally conceded to have been given by the Son of God to the apostles and the Church, he could hardly recognize any authority as equal to his own. The Lord left to Peter, he said, the government not only of all the Church, but of the whole world. He did not claim supreme power in earthly or purely secular affairs, except in the papal states. But he insisted that where the spiritual conflicted with the secular power, the spiritual power should be held as superior to the secular as the sun is to the moon. He shared the ideal of Gregory VII, that all governments should accept a place in a world state of which the Pope should be the head, with paramount authority over all matters of justice, morality, and faith, and for a time he almost realized that dream. In 1204, through the conquest of Constantinople by the Crusaders, he achieved one part of his plans. The Greek Church submitted to the Bishop of Rome, and Innocent could speak with joy of the seamless garment of Christ. He brought Serbia and even distant Armenia under the dominion of the Roman See. Gradually he secured control over ecclesiastical appointments and made the powerful episcopacy the organ and servant of the papacy. Through an astonishing succession of vital conflicts, he reduced the potentates of Europe to an unprecedented recognition of his sovereignty. His policies were least effective in Italy. He failed in repeated efforts to end the wars of the Italian city-states. And in Rome his political enemies made life so unsafe for him that for a time he had to shun his capital. King Sverre of Norway, from 1184 to 1202, successfully resisted him despite excommunication and interdict. Philip II of France ignored his command to make peace with England, but yielded to the Pope's insistence that he take back his discarded wife. Alfonso IX of Leon was persuaded to put away Berengaria, whom he had married within the forbidden degrees of kinship. Portugal, Aragon, Hungary, and Bulgaria acknowledged themselves as feudal fiefs of the papacy and sent it tribute yearly. When King John rejected Innocent's appointment of Langton as Archbishop of Canterbury, the Pope drove him by interdict and shrewd diplomacy to add England to the list of papal fiefs. Innocent extended his power in Germany by supporting Otto IV against Philip of Swabia, then Philip against Otto, then Otto against Frederick II, then Frederick against Otto, in each case exacting concessions to the papacy as the price of his favor and freeing the papal states from the threat of encirclement. He reminded the emperors that it was a pope who had translated the imperium, or imperial power, from the Greeks to the Franks, that Charlemagne had been made emperor only by papal anointment and coronation, and that what the popes had given they could take away. A Byzantine visitor to Rome described Innocent as the successor not of Peter, but of Constantine. He repelled all secular efforts to tax the Christian clergy without papal consent. He provided papal funds for necessitous priests, and labored to improve the education of the clergy. He raised the social status of the clergy by defining the church not as all Christian believers, but as all the Christian clergy. He condemned the episcopal or monastic absorption of parochial tithes at the expense of the parish priest. To reform monastic laxity, he ordered the regular surveillance and visitation of monasteries and convents. His legislation reduced to order the complex relations of clergy and laity, priest and bishop, bishop and pope. He developed the papal curia to an efficient court of counsel, administration, and judgment. It became now the most competent governing body of its time, and its methods and terminology helped to form the art and technique of diplomacy. Innocent himself was probably the best lawyer of the age, capable of finding legal support in logic and precedent for every decision that he made. Lawyers and learned men frequented the consistory, where he presided over the cardinals as a superior ecclesiastical court, to profit from his discussions and decisions on points of civil or canon law. Some called him Pater Juris, father of the law. Others, in fond humor, called him Solomon III. In his final triumph as legislator and pope, he presided in 1215 over the Fourth Lateran Council, held in the Church of St. John's Lateran in Rome. To this 12th ecumenical council came 1,500 abbots, bishops, archbishops, and other prelates, and plenipotentiaries from all the important nations of a united Christendom. The Pope's opening address was a bold admission and challenge. The corruption of the people has its chief source in the clergy. From this arise the evils of Christendom. Faith perishes, religion is defaced, justice is trodden underfoot, heretics multiply, schismatics are emboldened, the faithless grow strong, the Saracens triumph. The assembled power and intellect of the Church here allowed itself to be completely dominated by one man. His judgments became the Council's decrees. It allowed him to redefine the basic dogmas of the Church. Now, for the first time, the doctrine of transubstantiation was officially defined. It accepted his decrees requiring that a distinctive badge be worn by non-Christians in Christian lands. It responded enthusiastically to his call for a war against the Albigensian heretics. But it also followed his lead in recognizing the shortcomings of the Church. It denounced the peddling of fraudulent relics. It severely censured the indiscreet and superfluous indulgences which some prelates are not afraid to grant, whereby the keys of the Church are made contemptible, and the satisfaction of penance is deprived of its force. It attempted a far-reaching reform of monastic life. It denounced clerical drunkenness, immorality, and clandestine marriage, and passed vigorous measures against them. But it condemned the Albigensian claim that all sexual intercourse is sinful. In its attendance, scope, and effects, the Fourth Lateran Council was the most important assembly of the Church since the Council of Nicaea. From that apex of his career, Innocent declined rapidly to an early death. He had given himself so unremittingly to the administration and enlargement of his office that at 55 he was exhausted. "I have no leisure," he mourned, "to meditate on supramundane things. Scarce can I breathe. So much must I live for others that almost I am a stranger to myself." Perhaps in his last year he could look back upon his work and judge it more objectively than in the heat of strife. The crusades that he had organized for the reconquest of Palestine had failed. The one that would succeed after his death was the ferocious extermination of the Albigensians in southern France. He had won the admiration of his contemporaries, but not, like Gregory I or Leo IX, their affection. Some churchmen complained that he was too much the king, too little the priest. St. Lutgardus thought he could only by a narrow margin escape hell. And the Church herself, though proud of his genius and grateful for his labors, withheld from him that canonization which she had conferred upon lesser and more scrupulous men. But we must not refuse him the credit of having brought the Church to her greatest height, and close to the realization of her dream of a moral world state. He was the ablest statesman of his age. He pursued his aims with vision, devotion, flexible persistence, and unbelievable energy. When he died in 1216, the Church had reached a height of organization, splendor, repute, and power which she had never known before, and would only rarely and briefly know again. Honorius III, from 1216 to 1227, does not rank high in the cruel annals of history, because he was too gentle to carry on with vigor the war between empire and papacy. Gregory IX, from 1227 to 1241, though 80 when made pope, waged that war with almost fanatical tenacity, fought Frederick II so successfully as to postpone the Renaissance for 100 years, and organized the Inquisition. Yet he too was a man of unquestionable sincerity and heroic devotion, who defended what seemed to him the most precious possession of mankind, its Christ-begotten faith. He could not have been a hard man who, as cardinal, had protected and wisely guided the possibly heretical Francis. Innocent IV, from 1243 to 1254, destroyed Frederick II and sanctioned the use of torture by the Inquisition. He was a good patron of philosophy, aided the universities, and founded schools of law. Alexander IV, from 1254 to 1261, was a man of peace, kindly, merciful, and just, who astounded the world by his freedom from despotism. He deprecated the martial qualities of his predecessors, preferred piety to politics, and died of a broken heart, said a Franciscan chronicler, considering daily the terrible and increasing strife among Christians. Clement IV, from 1265 to 1268, returned to war, organized the defeat of Manfred, and ruined the Hohenstaufen dynasty and Imperial Germany. The recapture of Constantinople by the Greeks threatened to end the accord between the Greek and the Roman Church. But Gregory X, from 1271 to 1276, earned the gratitude of Michael Palaeologus by discountenancing the ambition of Charles of Anjou to conquer Byzantium. The restored Greek emperor submitted the Eastern Church to Rome, and the papacy was once again supreme. 8. The finances of the Church. A church that was actually a European superstate, dealing with the worship, morals, education, marriages, wars, crusades, deaths, and wills of the population of half a continent, sharing actively in the administration of secular affairs, and raising the most expensive structures in medieval history, could sustain its functions only through exploiting 100 sources of revenue. The widest stream of income was the tithe. After Charlemagne, all secular lands in Latin Christendom were required by state law to pay a tenth of their gross income or produce, in kind or money, to the local church. After the 10th century, every parish had to remit a part of its tithes to the bishop of the diocese. Under the influence of feudal ideas, the tithes of a parish could be enfeoffed, mortgaged, bequeathed, or sold like any other property or revenue, so that by the 12th century a financial web had been woven in which the local church and its priest were rather the collectors than the consumers of its tithes. The priest was expected to curse for his tithes, as the English put it, to excommunicate those who shirked or falsified their returns, for men were as reluctant then to pay tithes to the church, whose functions they considered vital to their salvation, as men are now to pay taxes to the state. We hear of occasional revolts of the tithe-payers. In Reggio Emilia, in 1280, says Fra Salimbene, the citizens, defying excommunication and interdict, promised one another that none should pledge the clergy any tithe, nor sit at meat with them, nor give them eat or drink. An excommunication in reverse, and the bishop was compelled to compromise. The basic revenue of the church was from her own lands. These she had received through gift or bequest, through purchase or defaulted mortgage, or through reclamation of waste lands by monastic or other ecclesiastic groups. In the feudal system, each owner or tenant was expected to leave something to the church at death. Those who did not were suspected of heresy and might be refused burial in consecrated ground. Since only a few of the laity could write, a priest was usually called in to draft the wills. Pope Alexander III decreed in 1170 that no one could make a valid will except in the presence of a priest. Any secular notary who drew up a will except under these conditions was to be excommunicated, and the church had exclusive jurisdiction over the probate of wills. Gifts or legacies to the church were held to be the most dependable means of telescoping the pains of purgatory. Many bequests to the church, especially before the year 1000, began with the words Adventante mundi vespero, since the evening of the world is near. Some owners, as we have seen, gave their property to the church in precarium, as disability insurance. The church provided an annuity and care in sickness and old age to the donor, and received the property free of lien at his death. Some monasteries, by confraternities, gave their benefactors a share in the merits or purgatorial deductions earned by the prayers and good works of the monks. Crusaders not only sold lands to the church at low prices to raise cash, but they received loans from church bodies on the security of pledged property, which was in many cases forfeited by default. Some persons, dying without natural heirs, left their whole estate to the church. The Countess Matilda of Tuscany tried to bequeath to the church almost a fourth of Italy. As the property of the church was inalienable, and before 1200 was normally free from secular taxation, it grew from century to century. It was not unusual for a cathedral, a monastery, or a nunnery to own several thousand manors, including a dozen towns or even a great city or two. The Bishop of Langres owned the whole county. The Abbey of St. Martin of Tours ruled over 20,000 serfs. The Bishop of Bologna held 2,000 manors. So did the Abbey of Lorch. The Abbey of Las Huelgas in Spain held 64 townships. In Castile, about 1,200, the church owned a quarter of the soil. In England, a fifth. In Germany, a third. In Livonia, 1/2. These, however, are loose and uncertain estimates. Such accumulations became the envy and target of the state. Charles Martel confiscated church property to finance his wars. Louis the Pious legislated against bequests that disinherited the children of the testator in favor of the church. Henry II of Germany stripped many monasteries of their lands, saying that monks were vowed to poverty, and several English statutes of mortmain put restrictions on the deeding of property to corporations, meaning ecclesiastical bodies. Edward I levied from the English church in 1291 a tenth of its property, and in 1294 a half of its annual revenue. Philip II began, St. Louis continued, Philip IV established the taxation of ecclesiastical property in France. As industry and commerce developed and money multiplied and prices rose, the income of abbeys and bishoprics, derived largely from feudal dues once fixed at a low price level and now hard to raise, proved inadequate not only for luxury but even for maintenance. By 1270 the majority of French cathedrals and abbeys were heavily in debt. They had borrowed from the bankers at high interest rates to meet the exactions of the kings. Hence, in part, the decline of architectural activity in France at the end of the 13th century. The popes added to the impoverishment of bishoprics by taxing their property and revenues, first to finance the Crusades, later to pay the mounting expenses of the papal see. New sources of central income became necessary as the papacy widened the area and complexity of its functions. Innocent III, in 1199, directed all bishops to send to the See of Peter yearly a 40th of their revenue. A cent, or tax, was levied upon all monasteries, convents, and churches that came directly under papal protection. An annat, theoretically the whole, actually half, the first year's revenue of a newly elected bishop, was required by the popes as a fee for confirming his appointment, and large sums were expected from recipients of the archiepiscopal pallium. All Christian households were asked to send an annual penny, some 90 cents, to the Roman see as Peter's pence. Normally, fees were charged for litigation brought to the papal court. The popes claimed the power to dispense in certain cases from canon law, as in permitting consanguineous marriage where some good political end seemed to justify the deviation, and fees were charged for legal processes involved in such dispensations. Considerable sums came to the popes from the recipients of papal indulgences and from pilgrims to Rome. It has been calculated that the total income of the papal see about 1250 was greater than the combined revenues of all the secular sovereigns of Europe. From England in 1252 the papacy received a sum thrice the revenue of the crown. The wealth of the Church, however proportionate to the extent of its functions, was the chief source of heresy in this age. Arnold of Brescia proclaimed that any priest or monk who died possessing property would surely go to hell. The Bogomiles, the Waldenses, the Paterines, the Catharai made headway by denouncing the wealth of the followers of Christ. A favorite satire in the 13th century was the Gospel according to marks of silver, which began, "In those days the Pope said to the Romans, 'When the Son of Man shall come to the seat of our Majesty, say first of all, Friend, wherefore art thou come hither? And if he give you naught, cast him forth into outer darkness.'" Throughout the literature of the time, in the Fabliaux, the Chanson de Geste, the Roman de la Rose, the poems of the wandering scholars, the troubadours, Dante, even in the monastic chroniclers, we find complaints of ecclesiastical avarice or wealth. Matthew Paris, an English monk, denounced the venality of English and Roman prelates living daintily on the patrimony of Christ. Hubert de Roman, head of the Dominican order, wrote of pardoners corrupting with bribes the prelates of the ecclesiastical courts. Petrus Cantor, a priest, told of priests who sold masses or vespers. Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, declaimed against the papal chancery as bought and sold, and quoted Henry II as boasting that he had the whole college of cardinals in his pay. Charges of corruption have been made against every government in history. They are nearly always partly true, and partly exaggerated from startling instances, but at times they rise to a revolutionary resentment. The same parishioners who built cathedrals to marry with their pennies could protest angrily against the collective propensities of the Church, and occasionally they murdered a pertinacious priest. The Church herself joined in this criticism of clerical money-grubbing and made many efforts to control the acquisitiveness and luxury of her personnel. Hundreds of clergymen, from St. Peter Damian, St. Bernard, St. Francis, and Cardinal de Vitry, down to simple monks, labored to mitigate these natural abuses. It is chiefly from the writings of such ecclesiastical reformers that our knowledge of the abuses is derived. A dozen monastic orders devoted themselves to preaching reform by their good example. Pope Alexander III and the Lateran Council of 1179 condemned the exaction of fees for administering baptism or extreme unction or performing a marriage, and Gregory X called the Ecumenical Council of Lyon in 1274 specifically to take measures for the reform of the Church. The popes themselves, in this age, showed no taste for luxury and earned their keep by arduous devotion to their exhausting tasks. It is the tragedy of things spiritual that they languish if unorganized, and are contaminated by the material needs of their organization. Chapter 28. The Early Inquisition, 1000 to 1300. 1. The Albigensian Heresy. Anti-clericalism rose to a flood at the end of the 12th century. There were, in the Age of Faith, recesses of religious mysticism and sentiment that escaped and resented organized sacerdotal Christianity. Moving perhaps with returning crusaders, new waves of Oriental mysticism flowed into the West. From Persia through Asia Minor and the Balkans came echoes of Manichaean dualism and Mazdakian communism. From Islam, a hostility to images, an obscure fatalism, and distaste for priests. And from the failure of the Crusades, a secret doubt as to the divine origin and support of the Christian Church. The Paulicians, driven westward by Byzantine persecution, carried through the Balkans into Italy and Provence their scorn of images, sacraments, and the clergy. They divided the cosmos into a spiritual world created by God and a material world created by Satan. And they identified Satan with the Yahweh of the Old Testament. The Bogomiles, that is, Friends of God, took form and name in Bulgaria, and spread especially in Bosnia. They were attacked by fire and sword at various times in the 13th century, defended themselves tenaciously, and finally, in 1463, surrendered not to Christianity, but to Islam. About the year 1000, a sect appeared in Toulouse and Orléans which denied the reality of miracles, the regenerative virtue of baptism, the presence of Christ in the Eucharist, and the efficacy of prayers to the saints. They were ignored for a time, then condemned, and 13 of their number were burned at the stake in 1023. Similar heresies developed and led to uprisings at Cambrai and Liège in 1025, in Goslar in 1052, Soissons in 1114, Cologne in 1146, etc. Berthold of Regensburg reckoned 150 heretical sects in the 13th century. Some were harmless groups who gathered to read the Bible to one another in the vernacular without a priest, and to put their own interpretation upon its disputed passages. Several, like the Humiliati in Italy, the Beguines and Begards in the Low Countries, were orthodox in everything except their embarrassing insistence that priests should live in poverty. The Franciscan movement arose as such a sect and narrowly escaped being classed as heretical. The Waldenses did not escape. About 1170, Peter Waldo, a rich merchant of Lyon, engaged some scholars to translate the Bible into the Languedoc of South France. He studied the translation zealously and concluded that Christians should live like the apostles, without individual property. He gave part of his wealth to his wife, distributed the remainder among the poor, and began to preach evangelical poverty. He gathered about him a small group, the poor men of Lyon, who dressed like monks, lived in chastity, went barefoot or in sandals, and pooled their earnings communistically. For a time the clergy made no objection, and allowed them to read and sing in the churches. But when Peter thrust his sickle into another man's harvest in too literal fulfillment of the gospel, the Archbishop of Lyon sharply reminded him that only bishops were allowed to preach. Peter went to Rome in 1179 and asked Alexander III for a preaching license. It was granted on condition of consent and supervision by the local clergy. Peter resumed his preaching, apparently without such local consent. His followers became devotees of the Bible and learned large sections of it by heart. Gradually, the movement took on an anti-sacerdotal tinge, rejected all priesthood, denied the validity of sacraments administered by a sinful priest, and attributed to every believer in a state of sanctity the power to forgive sins. Some members repudiated indulgences, purgatory, transubstantiation, and prayer to the saints. One group preached that all things should be in common. Another identified the Church with the Scarlet Woman of the Apocalypse. The sect was condemned in 1184. One part of it, the Poor Catholics, was received into the Church in 1206 by Innocent III. The majority persisted in heresy and spread through France into Spain and Germany. Probably to check their increase, a council of Toulouse in 1229 decreed that no layfolk should possess scriptural books except the Psalter and the Hours, which were chiefly psalms. Nor should they read these except in Latin, for no vernacular translation had yet been examined and guaranteed by the Church. In the suppression of the Albigenses, thousands of Waldenses went to the stake. Peter himself died in Bohemia in 1217, apparently by a natural death. By the middle of the 12th century, the towns of Western Europe were honeycombed with heretical sects. The cities, said a bishop in 1190, are filled with these false prophets. Milan alone had 17 new religions. The leading heretics there were the Patarines, named apparently from Pataria, a poor quarter of the town. The movement seems to have begun as a protest against the rich. It was turned to anti-clericalism, denounced the simony, wealth, marriage, and concubinage of the clergy, and proposed, in the words of one leader, that the wealth of the clergy be impounded, their property put up at auction. If they resist, let their houses be given up to pillage, and let them and their bastards be hounded out of the city. Similar anti-clerical parties rose in Viterbo, Orvieto, Verona, Ferrara, Parma, Piacenza, Rimini. At times they dominated the popular assemblies, captured city governments, and taxed the clergy to pay for civic enterprises. Innocent III instructed his legate in Lombardy to exact an oath from all municipal officials that they would not appoint or admit heretics to office. In 1237, a Milanese mob, blaspheming and reviling, polluted several churches with unmentionable filth. The most powerful of the heretical sects was variously named Catharai, from the Greek for pure, Bulgarai, from their Balkan provenance, whence the abusive term bugger, and Albigenses, from the French town of Albi, where they were especially numerous. Montpellier, Narbonne, and Marseille were the first French centers of the heresy, perhaps through contact with Moslems and Jews, and through frequentation by merchants from heretical centers in Bosnia, Bulgaria, and Italy. Merchants spread the movement to Toulouse, Orléans, Soissons, Arras, and Reims, but Languedoc and Provence remained its strongholds. There, French medieval civilization had reached its height. The great religions mingled in urbane amity. Women were imperiously beautiful, morals were loose, troubadours spread gay ideas, and as in Frederick's Italy, the Renaissance was ready to begin. Southern France was at that time, around 1200, composed of practically independent principalities, tenuously bound in theoretical allegiance to the King of France. In this region, the Counts of Toulouse were the greatest lords, possessing territories more extensive than those directly owned by the king. The doctrines and practices of the Catharai were in part a return to primitive Christian beliefs and ways, partly a vague memory of the Arian heresy that had prevailed in southern France under the Visigoths, partly a product of Manichaean and other Oriental ideas. They had a black-robed clergy of priests and bishops called perfecti, who at their ordination vowed to leave parents, mate, and children to devote themselves to God and the gospel, never to touch a woman, never to kill an animal, never to eat meat, eggs, or dairy food, nor anything but fish and vegetables. The believers, or credentes, were followers who promised to take these vows later. They were allowed meanwhile to eat meat and marry, but they were required to renounce the Catholic Church, to advance toward the perfect life, and to greet any of the perfecti with triple and reverent genuflection. The theology of the Catharai divided the cosmos Manichaeanly into good, God, spirit, heaven, and evil, Satan, matter, the material universe. Satan, not God, created the visible world. All matter was accounted evil, including the cross on which Christ died, and the consecrated host of the Eucharist. Christ spoke only figuratively when he said of the bread, "This is my body." All flesh was matter, and all contact with it was impurity. All sexual congress was sinful. The sin of Adam and Eve was coitus. Opponents describe the Albigenses as rejecting the sacraments of the Mass, the veneration of images, the Trinity, and the virgin birth. Christ was an angel, but not one with God. They repudiated, we are told, the institution of private property and aspired to an equality of goods. They made the Sermon on the Mount the essence of their ethics. They were taught to love their enemies, to care for the sick and the poor, never to swear, always to keep the peace. Force was never moral, even against infidels. Capital punishment was a capital crime. One should quietly trust that in the end God would triumph over evil, without using evil means. There was no hell or purgatory in this theology. Every soul would be saved, if only after many purifying transmigrations. To attain heaven one had to die in a state of purity. For this it was necessary to receive from a Catharist priest the consolamentum, a last sacrament which completely cleansed the soul of sin. Cathari believers, like some early Christians in the case of baptism, postponed this sacrament to what they judged to be their final illness. Those who recovered ran a risk of acquiring new impurity and dying without the consolamentum. Hence it was a great misfortune to recover after receiving it, and it is charged that the Albigensian priests, to avert this calamity, persuaded many a recovering patient to starve himself into paradise. Sometimes, we are assured, they made matters certain by suffocating a patient with his consent. The Church might have allowed this sect to die of its own suicide had not the Cathari engaged in active criticism of the Church. They denied that the Church was the Church of Christ. St. Peter had never come to Rome, had never founded the papacy. The popes were successors to the emperors, not to the apostles. Christ had no place to lay his head, but the pope lived in a palace. Christ was propertyless and penniless, but Christian prelates were rich. Surely, said the Cathari, these lordly archbishops and bishops, these worldly priests, these fat monks, were the Pharisees of old returned to life. The Roman Church, they were sure, was the whore of Babylon. The clergy were a synagogue of Satan. The Pope was Antichrist. They denounced the preachers of crusades as murderers. Many of them laughed at indulgences and relics. One group, it is alleged, made an image of the Virgin, ugly, one-eyed, and deformed, pretended to work miracles with it, secured wide credence for the imposture, and then revealed the hoax. Many views of the Cathari were spread on the wings of song by troubadours who resented the ethics of Christ without quite adopting those of the new sect. All the leading troubadours except two were considered to be on the side of the Albigensians. These troubadours made fun of pilgrims, confession, holy water, the cross. They called the churches dens of thieves, and Catholic priests seemed to them traitors, liars, and hypocrites. For some time the Cathari received a broad toleration from the ecclesiastics and the secular powers of southern France. Apparently the people were allowed to choose freely between the old religion and the new. Public debates were held between Catholic and Catharist theologians. One such took place at Carcassonne, in the presence of a papal legate and King Pedro II of Aragon, this in 1204. In 1167, various branches of the Cathari held a council of their clergy, attended by representatives from several countries. It discussed and regulated Catharist doctrine, discipline, and administration, and adjourned without having been disturbed. Moreover, the nobility found it desirable to weaken the church in Languedoc. The church was rich and owned much land. The nobles, relatively poor, began to seize church property. In 1171, Roger II, Viscount of Béziers, sacked an abbey, threw the Bishop of Albi into prison, and sent a heretic to guard him. When the monks of Valais chose an abbot unsatisfactory to the Viscount, he burned the monastery and jailed the abbot. When the latter died, the merry Viscount installed his corpse in the pulpit and persuaded the monks to choose a pleasing substitute. Raymond Roger, Count of Foix, drove abbot and monks from the abbey of Pamiers. His horses ate oats from the altar. His soldiers used the arms and legs of the crucifixes as pestles to grind grain, and practiced their marksmanship upon the image of Christ. Count Raymond VI of Toulouse destroyed several churches, persecuted the monks of Moissac, and was excommunicated in 1196. But excommunication had become a trifle to the nobles of southern France. Many of them openly professed or liberally protected the Catharist heresy. Innocent III, coming to the papacy in 1198, saw in these developments a threat to both church and state. He recognized some excuse for criticism of the Church, but he felt that he could hardly remain idle when the great ecclesiastical organization, for which he had such lofty plans and hopes, and which seemed to him the chief bulwark against human violence, social chaos, and royal iniquity, was attacked in its very foundations, robbed of its possessions and dignity, and mocked with blasphemous travesties. The state, too, had committed sins and cherished corruption and unworthy officials, but only fools wished to destroy it. How could any continuing social order be built on the principles that forbade parentage and counseled suicide? Could any economy prosper on the idolatry of poverty and without the incentives of property? Could the relations of the sexes and the rearing of children be rescued from a wild disorder except by some such institution as marriage? Catharism seemed to Innocent a mess of nonsense, made poisonous by the simplicity of the people. What was the sense of a crusade against infidels in Palestine when these Albigensian infidels were multiplying in the heart of Christendom? 2 months after his accession, Innocent wrote to the Archbishop of Auch in Gascony, "The little boat of St. Peter is beaten by many storms and tossed about on the sea. But it grieves me most of all that there are now arising, more unrestrainedly and injuriously than ever before, ministers of diabolical error who are ensnaring the souls of the simple. With their superstitions and false inventions, they are perverting the meaning of the Holy Scriptures and trying to destroy the unity of the Catholic Church. Since this pestilential error is growing in Gascony and the neighboring territories, we wish you and your fellow bishops to resist it with all your might. We give you a strict command that, by whatever means you can, you destroy all these heresies and repel from your diocese all who are polluted by them. If necessary, you may cause the princes and people to suppress them with the sword." The Archbishop of Auch, a man indulgent to others as well as to himself, seems to have taken no action on this letter, and the Archbishop of Narbonne and the Bishop of Béziers resisted the papal legates that Innocent sent to enforce his decrees. About this time 6 noble ladies, led by the sister of the Count of Foix, were converted to Catharism in a public ceremony attended by many of the nobility. Innocent replaced his unsuccessful legates with a more resolute agent, Arnaud, head of the Cistercian monks, this in 1204. He gave him extraordinary powers to make inquisition throughout France, and commissioned him to offer a plenary indulgence to the king and nobles of France for aid in suppressing the Catharist heresy. To Philip Augustus, in return for such aid, the Pope offered the lands of all who should fail to join in a crusade against the Albigensians. Philip demurred. He had just conquered Normandy and wanted time for digestion. Raymond VI of Toulouse agreed to use persuasion on the heretics, but refused to join in a war against them. Innocent excommunicated him. He promised to comply, was absolved, and proved negligent again. "How can we do it?" asked a knight who had been commanded by a papal legate to expel the Cathari from their lands. "We have been brought up with these people, we have kindred among them, and we see them living righteously." St. Dominic entered the scene from Spain, preached peaceably against the heretics, and made converts to orthodoxy by the holiness of his life. Perhaps the problem could have been met by such means, aided by clerical reform, had not Pierre de Castelnau, a papal legate, been slain by a knight who was thereafter protected by Raymond. Innocent, who had borne with patience the frustration of his efforts against the heresy for almost 10 years, now resorted to extreme measures. He excommunicated Raymond and all his abettors, laid under interdict all lands subject to them, and offered these lands to any Christian who could seize them. He summoned Christians from all countries to a crusade against the Albigensians and their protectors. Philip Augustus allowed many barons of his realm to enlist, and contingents came from Germany and Italy. To all participants the same plenary indulgence was promised as to those who took the cross for Palestine. Raymond asked forgiveness, did public penance, being scourged half-naked in the church of Saint-Gilles, was absolved again, and joined the Holy War in 1209. Most of the population of Languedoc, nobles and commoners alike, resisted the Crusaders, seeing in the attack of northern barons and soldiers of fortune an attempt to seize their lands under cover of religious zeal. Even the Orthodox Christians of the south fought the invasion from the north. When the Crusaders approached Béziers, they offered to spare it the horrors of war if it would surrender all heretics listed by its bishop. The city leaders refused, saying they would rather stand siege till they should be reduced to eating their children. The Crusaders scaled the walls, captured the town, and slew 20,000 men, women, and children in indiscriminate massacre, even those who had sought asylum in the church. Caesarius of Heisterbach, a Cistercian monk writing 20 years after, is our only authority for the story that when Arnaud, the papal legate, was asked should Catholics be spared, he answered, "Kill them all, for God knows his own." Perhaps he feared that all the defeated would profess orthodoxy for the occasion. Béziers having been burned to the ground, the Crusaders, led by Raymond, advanced to attack the fortress of Carcassonne, where Raymond's nephew, Count Roger of Béziers, made a final stand. The fortress was taken, and Roger died of dysentery. The bravest leader in this siege was Simon de Montfort. Born in France about 1170, he was the elder son of the Lord of Montfort, near Paris. He became Earl of Leicester through his English mother. Like many men of that swashbuckling age, he was able to combine great piety with great wars. He heard Mass every day, was famous for his chastity, and had served with honor in Palestine. With his small army of 4,500 men, and urged on by the papal legate, he now assaulted town after town, overcame all resistance, and gave the population a choice between swearing allegiance to the Roman faith or suffering death as heretics. Thousands swore, hundreds preferred death. For 4 years Simon continued his campaigns, devastating nearly all the territory of Count Raymond except Toulouse. In 1215 Toulouse itself surrendered to him. Count Raymond was deposed by a council of prelates at Montpellier, and Simon succeeded to his title and most of his lands. Innocent III did not quite approve of these proceedings. He was shocked to find that the Crusaders had appropriated the holdings of men never guilty of heresy, and had robbed and murdered like savage buccaneers. Taking mercy on Raymond, he assigned him an annuity, and took under the care of the Church a portion of his lands in trust for Raymond's son. Raymond VII, coming of age, recaptured Toulouse. Simon died in a second siege of the city in 1218. The crusade was suspended now that Innocent had died, and such Albigensian devotees as had survived came forth to practice and preach again under the lenient rule of the new Count of Toulouse. In 1223, Louis VIII of France offered to depose Raymond VII and to crush out all heresy in Raymond's territory if Honorius III would allow him to add the region to the royal domain. We do not know the Pope's reply, but a new crusade was begun, and Louis was on the verge of victory when he died at Montpensier in 1226. Seizing the opportunity to make peace with Blanche of Castile, regent for Louis IX, Raymond offered the hand of his daughter Jeanne to Louis's brother Alphonse, with the reversion of Raymond's lands to Jeanne and her husband at Raymond's death. Blanche, harassed by rebellious nobles, accepted, and Pope Gregory IX approved on Raymond's pledge to suppress all heresy. A treaty of peace was signed at Paris in 1229, and the Albigensian Wars came to an end after 30 years of strife and devastation. Orthodoxy triumphed, toleration ceased, and the Council of Narbonne in 1229 forbade the possession of any part of the Bible by laymen. Feudalism spread, municipal liberty declined, the gay age of the troubadours passed away in southern France. In 1271, Jeanne and Alphonse, who had inherited Raymond's possessions, died without issue, and the spacious county of Toulouse fell to Louis IX and the French crown. Central France now had free commercial outlets on the Mediterranean, and France had taken a great step toward unity. This, and the Inquisition, were the chief results of the Albigensian Crusades. 2. The background of the Inquisition. The Old Testament laid down a simple code for dealing with heretics. They were to be carefully examined, and if 3 reputable witnesses testified to their having gone and served other gods, the heretics were to be led out from the city and stoned with stones till they die. See Deuteronomy, chapter 17, verse 25. If there arise among you a prophet, or a dreamer of dreams, saying, Let us go after other gods, that prophet or that dreamer of dreams shall be put to death. If thy brother, or thy son, or thy daughter, or the wife of thy bosom, or thy friend, which is thine own soul, entice thee secretly, saying, Let us go and serve other gods, thou shalt not consent unto him, nor hearken unto him. Neither shalt thine eye pity him, neither shalt thou conceal him, but thou shalt surely kill him. Deuteronomy, chapter 13, verses 1 through 9. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Exodus, chapter 22, verse 18. According to the Gospel of St. John, chapter 15, verse 6, Jesus accepted this tradition. If anyone abide not in me, he shall be cast forth as a branch, and shall wither, and they shall gather him up and cast him into the fire, and he burneth. Medieval Jewish communities retained the biblical law of heresy in theory, but rarely practiced it. Maimonides adopted it without reserve. The laws of the Greeks made asabeia, failure to worship the gods of the Orthodox Hellenic pantheon, a capital crime. It was by such a law that Socrates was put to death. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.